Hi again. Okay, I'll just continue on from what I was talking about last time. So basically, just to finish off in regard to talking about the Newcastle and the British context. So what happened was, and again, a lot of us might be aware of it, particularly working in a British and an Irish context, but this whole area of commissioning, which is to an extent happening not just in youth work services, but in a lot of various parts of the social professions and the social services, okay? So basically, with these cuts that were happening, these massive cuts that were happening in Newcastle, what the council did was essentially put out a tender for things like youth services to be run. So whichever organisation or whoever could put in the best price, they would get the money to run the services. And a lot of you are aware of this, particularly in a British context at the moment. I know one example at the moment is that Virgin Care, which is part of the Virgin Group, Richard Branson, have now put in a tender. They won a tender to win one of the social work services. So now they're actually running, I can't remember where it is now, a social work service in Britain anyway. But basically, this is what happened, and this is what has been happening more and more so with youth work in Britain, and we can see it a little bit in Ireland as well. So that tenders are being put out for youth work services to be run, and often it's the bigger organisations that are able to win these tenders. So they're putting in that they can do it for whatever the lowest amount of money. But how can they do it for the lowest amount of money? Well, essentially that will mean paying less wages to people like the people on the front line, such as the youth workers, and then obviously contracts will be questionable. So you'll have more and more of these part-time contracts or 0-hour contracts. So conditions then obviously are questioned because obviously they're not non-for-profit, okay? So basically, a national organisation won that contract in Newcastle, and this meant that a significant amount of the money that they got was used then for management to run the project. Whereas if you had local organisations running, you didn't have that management element that comes with a national organisation running it, okay? So this has been seen more and more. So what has been some of the consequences of the commission? And again, do look a little bit more in depth in the article that I've given you, Business as Usual, because that goes into it in a lot more detail, and will give you a little bit more of a sense of what I'm talking about. So what have been some of the consequences of this commission in Newcastle and in Britain as a whole? So it's been subcontracting. So again, as you would know, that with subcontracting, less and less of the money obviously will end up going into the pockets of the frontline workers, because it's took out through administration, it's took out through management salaries, okay? Fragmentation of youth workers and the organisations, resignation of youth workers, national organisations moving in, which has seen the diminution of local services with local people for local people. More of a focus on what we've already talked about, on targeted contract approaches, okay? So we're given, a tender is being put out for organisations to work with particular young people. That's where the money is going, okay? It's not for all it's not for all young people, all communities, for particular young people dealing with particular issues, that we can see these focused and accountable and quantitative outcomes coming out from that, okay? So therefore the focus is often more so, which I've talked about before, on intervention as opposed to work with young people as a whole through a universal approach. So some of the changes in youth work that have happened over the past number of years in Ireland and Britain is that Britain has seen changes in government policy that are reshaping youth work, such as that commissioning and the focus on more targeted work, more focused on individual work, outcomes-based work, which we've just spoken about. suggestion that this is coming from Malachy, suggestion that there is a concern about this in the Irish context, and some of you again will have more ideas on this, and I would urge you to have a look and have a think about what is happening in an Irish context in regard to funding. Where is funding going? And do we see a process of commissioning maybe occurring in an Irish context? Has it occurred already? Do you know of examples? A need for evidence, but again, this goes back to find evidence. Okay, so when funders are looking for evidence of youth work and how it's happened, what does this evidence look like? Are we asked for our stories youth work, or are we asked to account for in numbers and what particular programs we have run, activities we've run? There's concern also in Malachy's research that youth work as a political and educational practice is under threat, which is really interesting. Why do you think this would be so? Because, and I'd urge you to have a think about this, but one suggestion would be that, if youth work are being cut, and less money and less conditions for youth workers, and it's less about local people getting involved than and more so about national organisations who don't necessarily have a connection or understand needs. As we know, if a youth worker is working with young people, they need to understand the needs, what's going on. If there's not that local perspective anymore, and that youth work is just trying to survive, it's very hard for youth workers and youth work as a metaphor to try and stick its head out of the sand and try and challenge what's going on if youth workers and youth work is being fed scraps, I suppose, for want of a better way of saying it. The perception by youth workers in Malachy's research is that there's more of a focus now on targeted youth because it's easier to report. So targeted, very much so, you'd be thinking in an Irish context of the Garda diversion projects and the family support projects, and I'll let you make up your own mind in regard to those, and where you think they're going, and where you think the more so the SPI funded, the more universal youth work is going. Okay, so the first perspective of youth workers in Malachy's research is that crime, family support, unemployment and child protection is where all the money is going for youth work, not so much on those universal approach, youth work. Okay, and that there's a move from youth work as a practice, responding to the needs of young people, to responding to defined targets. Again, have a think about that. Have a think about that in a British context, and also, it's important in a Greek context to know the path that professional youth work is on at the moment in a British and an Irish context. The second perspective of youth workers, and I spoke about this already in regard to youth workers saying that, they had to be more creative because there wasn't that pool, that bank of money to draw from. But that the youth workers say that austerity could also offer opportunities. Okay, policies could be offered which redefine youth work. Okay, which look at it again from a different perspective. But, however, it's to keep in mind, and this goes back to the commissioning that I talked about a few minutes ago, policies may also lead to privatisation and deprofessionalisation of youth work, okay? And this is why we as youth workers need to be aware of this, why we need to challenge this, and how, again, to use that metaphor, we need to stick our head out of the sand and look at what's going on around us, okay? Is there commissioning? Where's the money come from? Where the resources come from? How are organisations being run? Are we in competition with other organisations in regard to achieving these tenders, getting these tenders? Okay, so in response to this, we in Ireland and in Britain have set up the Irish Youth Worker Association and In Defence of Youth Work, okay? So a bit similar, the Irish Youth Worker Association, a bit similar to the model we were looking at in Tim Corney and Broadbent's article in regard to youth work in Australia. So the Irish Youth Worker Association was set up in 2013 by youth workers for youth workers, and they say we are an organisation who understand the uniqueness of youth work practice and are determined to protect youth work across the island of Ireland and in these times of change. So youth workers said, no, we've had enough. We need to start taking a stand. We need to start reevaluating, relooking, what are we about? How are we doing it? Why are we doing it? And we need to be able to respond to government from a very strong standpoint in regard to, we know who we are and we can articulate that, and we can articulate what we do in the way that we do it, okay? And this comes back to Gene Spence's premise of trying to account for and speak about and relate youth work in a way that we as youth workers understand in our language, and this is through the stories and through the conversations, okay? And not necessarily through the numbers, okay? So the Irish Youth Worker Association perceives its role as the following, that is promoting and protecting youth work. Activities so far has been that it has been writing a constitution, a code of ethics, and its strategy has been to link with trade unions and other national organisations. So a lot of these elements we've seen already in regard to Australia and how they have evolved their youth work organisations, as you saw in the Broadbent article, over the years, how they have tried to become stronger and tried to retain a voice in regard to what they do and how they do it. So, and these organisations, Irish Youth Worker Association, the Australian organisation, are looking at, should we be, is youth work to an extent being compromised by the funding that it's getting? So, is youth work being compromised? Is youth worker and its underlying principles being compromised in a context such as maybe a Garda diversion role or a family support role? Are we still able to do youth work and work guided by youth work principles while also being funded by youth justice, okay? So these are some of the questions that are coming up, okay? So the goal is for the voice of the youth work profession to be heard at a national level, okay? So Devlin says, a central challenge at the moment, this was in 2008, but I think still holds very strongly even in 2017. A central challenge for youth work and youth workers will be to retain a core sense of vision and purpose regarding the relational, educational and associative mission of youth work in a climate of increasing managerialism and outcome-focused accountability, okay? And that's really important, and I still think really strongly resonates with us as youth workers at the moment, okay? So in Britain, you also had, which was set up previous to this, a campaign called In Defence of Youth Work. Again, you can go onto the In Defence of Youth Work website, look at what they're doing, how they're doing it. It's really interesting website. They talk about using stories and using conversations to try and get across what youth work is about, as opposed to, just seeing the game of football, just seeing the baking program, the cooking program. What do youth workers do? And this is captured through stories from youth workers and stories from young people, and that's the video I show you in this session has been made by In Defence of Youth Work, talking to young people about youth work and what it does, okay? So the In Defence of Youth Work campaign seeks to defend and extend youth work as a distinctive education practice founded on a voluntary relationship with young people and shaped by their agendas. The challenges they see are the predetermined targets, which we've talked about, and the outcomes. One of their key activities is gathering stories from youth workers about what they do and how, and this is premised on youth workers' use of conversation and story to describe their work, as opposed to numbers and activities being filled out on a funding form. So in conclusion, to finish off, there are opportunities and challenges within the current climate as countries try to emerge from austerity in Europe. However, as youth workers, we need to make ourselves heard through our own language and work together to uphold the underlying principles of youth work. And I hope the articles, when you've read the articles, that they'll go in a little bit more depth into what I have spoken about with you. I've just given you, as usual, a snapshot. So please do read the articles and you'll get a bit more of a sense of what I'm talking about, okay? And yeah, so that is it. So if you tried the quiz again, as usual, and best of luck. Thanks very much.